You're tuned into the Counterflow Podcast, home of dissident voices,
unapproved opinions.
But you gotta get ready.
You ready?
Now here's your host
and humble narrator,
Buck Johnson. Let's go.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Counterflow Podcast. As always, I am still your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson, still coming to you from the beautiful, lovely, small, quaint, awesome Lockhart, Texas, barbecue capital of the world. Yes, that's right. Today, G.M. Davis is back with us. He was back, might have been back over a year ago that he was with us. We talked about his book, Antichrist, the Fulfillment of Globalization. We will be bringing some of the themes in that book up today as well. And of course, his new piece entitled, Is God an Antisemite? Ooh, that's a spicy title. We're going to be talking about anti-Semitism. What is that? Why does the left constantly deflate these words and just scatter them across the landscape and label everyone as racist, anti-Semite? It's like the words lose meaning. So we're going to discuss what it actually means, what the Jewish people think it means. We're talking about, the early church, of course, the Orthodox Church. What is Judeo-Christianity? Why do people say that? What is that? Doesn't make any sense, does it? We're talking about all of these things. I hope you guys enjoy this episode. So without further ado, it's been way too long since I've had you on. Welcome back to the show, Mr. G.M. Davis. How are you?
All right. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, the time I had you on before, we're going to talk about this in this interview too, but I want to show everyone if you're watching this, you get the added benefit of seeing this book that I'm showing you, Antichrist, the Fulfillment of Globalization. And we'll talk some more about that as well in this interview. But I'll let you do an intro for yourself, who you are, what you do, and we'll jump in from there.
Well, my background is in political science. I was at the University of Rochester in New York and then Stanford, where I studied political science many years ago. And was interested really in totalitarianism and what I would call the political religions, like National Socialism, Communism, that sort of thing, where the church, the traditional church, is expelled from society and basically replaced with the state. That's what interested me. And so the book you showed, Antichrist, deals a lot with that concept, and especially at a global level. So I wrote that a few years ago from Uncut Mountain Press. And then recently I wrote, in some ways, a related piece, an essay critiquing Robert Spencer's latest book, Antisemitism, History and Myth. I was very critical of that book. And indeed, I think of the contemporary understanding of what anti-Semitism is. And we can talk about how these concepts are related, the New World Order, which continues to build around us, and what some people call Judeo-Christianity.
Yes. Yeah, I've done a few episodes already on this because I find it to be an important topic, and especially in this current moment. We can start with the term anti-Semitism. There's these words that our culture starts to almost make useless, and it's, racist it's just like, fascism, all of these things they just throw out. If you're, using Donald Trump and equating him to who we'll call the tiny mustache man, you're sort of losing the impact of these words and what they actually mean. So we'll start with anti-Semitism.
Well, I think, one of the failings of Spencer's book is that even in the whole book, he doesn't really define the term. I think it means, according to him and many people, hatred of Jews. So if you hate Jews, you're an anti-Semite. And of course, the word, though, is misleading because most Semites aren't Jewish, and many Jews aren't Semites. But of course, it's come down to us really from Germany in the mid-19th century when it was first used as a term to describe hatred of Jews. And that's sort of how I address it in my essay. But the word itself does tend to be rather misleading. Arabs are Semites and others and so on. Part of a language group really is what that meant originally. But now it's being used, applied just to Jews and or Judaism.
Let's talk about also that term Judeo-Christianity. I grew up hearing it. I would hear, the founders of this country practiced Judeo-Christian values and things of that nature. Where does that term go wrong, in your opinion?
Well, for me, it's fundamentally an oxymoron because by using that term, Judeo-Christian, you're trying to unite two things that make logically opposite claims, namely about who is Jesus of Nazareth. Either he's the Christ, the Messiah, which of course is what Christianity, certainly Orthodox Christianity, affirms, or he's not. And that's the affirmation of Judaism. You can't accept Jesus as Lord and Savior, as the Christ, and adhere to Judaism. It's logically impossible, even though you hear terms like Jews for Jesus and that sort of thing. These are really fringe things. And again, I think they do violence to basic rules of logic. So you can be Judaic in your outlook, or you can be Christian in your outlook, but you can't be Judeo-Christian. It doesn't make any sense. I think it's used for diplomatic or political reasons, basically to try and maintain the alliance politically in this country and elsewhere between many heterodox Christians, Protestants and others, and the Zionist movement. But as a useful theological or precise term in any way, it just doesn't hold water.
In your mind, is there a misleading narrative or confusion maybe on the Judaism of the Old Testament and versus what we have now? Or some people will say, I'm an Old Testament Jew, and then what happened in the New Testament with some Jews and then not others, and then what we have now. Do you see confusion or maybe even purposeful incorrect narratives around that?
Yes, certainly. As Orthodox Christians, we affirm that we are the Israel of God. That's the phrase that St. Paul uses. And what that means is Israel, roughly translated, means those who see God or the people of God. So the whole question is, who is Israel? Is it the quote-unquote chosen nation of the Jews, or is it those who are faithful to Orthodox Christianity? That's the whole question. And those two things, needless to say, are exclusive. So Judaism now is really it developed as a reaction to the rise of the church in the first centuries AD. It's not the religion of the Old Testament. The Orthodox Church is the religion of the Old Testament under the new dispensation. And so really Rabbinic Judaism today dates back to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD and the successive Jewish-Roman wars. And it was basically, Rabbinic Judaism was a means of cobbling together different elements of Hebrew life and making it work in a context in which there was no longer any temple, in which there was no longer room for blood sacrifice. So that's really where modern Rabbinic Judaism came out of. And it is profoundly anti-Christian, if we're going to be honest. Being opposed to, but also in place of. Because it was a reaction to the rise of the church and both the Jewish or Hebrew following of Christ and the Gentile world following Christ.
Yeah, I want to emphasize this point because it's there's so much, especially when you see X/Twitter now. There's a grouping of somewhat, let's say, right of center influencers that are heavily pushing this. Well, guys, stop with the anti-Semitism. Jesus was a Jew. And it's very misleading. I assume they understand that and they're doing it on purpose. You know, I don't try to get in someone's mind of, do they not know any better, or are they doing this to be misleading? I don't know. But I think it's important. And I've had this discussion with people, and I say the Jewish religion of today, Rabbinic Judaism, was made after the resurrection and the ascension of Christ as a direct opposition to that. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. I just can't emphasize that enough because there's so much. I grew up, I mean, my listeners are tired of me saying this, but I went to John Hagee's church. Are you familiar with him?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So I, of course, grew up, or at least in my teenage years, seeing and hearing this sort of narrative. And one of the reasons I've done so many episodes sort of critiquing it and taking it apart is because I saw thousands of people at that church every Sunday. There still are. He's on TV. I'm sort of falling for this Zionistic theology that's very much opposed to Orthodox Christianity.
Yes, and the question of who is Jesus of Nazareth? Is he a Jew? The answer we have to affirm is absolutely yes.
Yes.
He descended from the patriarch Judah, and he must be a Jew in order to be the Messiah. That's part of the prophecies, and he even says in the Gospels that salvation's from the Jews or of the Jews. But the question is, what do we mean by that? Mm-hmm. So it's just like transposing the word Israel. God speaks to Israel, the Hebrew nation, in the Old Testament. And now we have this nation state in the Middle East called Israel. Well, is it the same thing? It has the same name, but is it the same thing? And the answer is no. And indeed, I titled my essay, my critique of Spencer's book, as "Is God an Antisemite?" Because according to what God says in the Old Testament to Moses and through the other prophets, a lot of it might be viewed today, if you took it out of its context, as anti-Semitic or as anti-Jewish. Because really the story of the Old Testament is God rebuking his people and trying to get them to turn away from idols and paganism and all sorts of unseemly practices. That's really what the prophetic office was about. And Christ fulfilled that as, in a sense, the last prophet, the last admonition to the Hebrew nation before, of course, he was killed by them. So really, and then Judaism, like Judaism today, has really nothing to do with Judaism in the Old Testament. In fact, I wouldn't even call it Judaism of the Old Testament. I would call it the biblical religion, the Old Testament religion, the Hebraic religion, so as not to get confused.
As you guys know, the team at Podsworth Media has worked with me for a long time producing this show. A big part of that over the past couple of years has been them using their Podsworth app to make the audio sound clean, level, professional, even when the raw recordings were super sketchy, which mine can be sometimes. In fact, this one that you're listening to right now is super sketchy. I took this microphone sock off here just to show you how crappy it will sound, except when they put it through the Podsworth app, it sounds beautiful. I've got this annoying white noise maker going on. It's driving me crazy. If you want to hear how bad this recording is before they put it through the Podsworth app, you can hear the full before and after demo for yourself at the link in the description. The app recently got a huge update and it's better than ever. So good, in fact, that it can take almost any atrocious voice recordings and make it sound great. They remove background noise. It cuts down on plosives. It fixes clipping when your gain is too high. It reduces reverb, removes clicks, pops, improves tone, and the level of the dialogue is even and consistent. So if I move around like this, which I sometimes do when I get excited, it'll fix all of that. It's super simple. Go to podsworth.com, click Get Started. Drag and drop your audio files or open them right from your smartphone browser. customize your settings if you want, but honestly, the default works great for most podcast recordings. Here's the cool part. Enter code BUCK50, BUCK50 for 50% off of your first order. No account needed, just email and payment. Then you get the download link in your inbox with your cleaned up files. It's perfect for podcasts, YouTube videos, sermons, homilies, audiobooks, anything like that you want to sound legitimate and professional. Remember, use code BUCK50 for half off your first order. And you're supporting this show. Thank you, guys.
Talk about if you see it as this, is there tension between the Orthodox Church and Rabbinic Judaism today?
Yes, there is. In the sense, there has to be. If that tension is lost for some reason, we know we've taken a wrong turn. There is going to be tension because it's the Orthodox Church which affirms the Christhood of Jesus of Nazareth. And it's Rabbinic Judaism that most explicitly denies that. So the question is, somebody's right and somebody's wrong. You can't have both, which again is why you can't have something called Judeo-Christianity. So yes, there is a tension. There was a tension when Christ came and rebuked the Pharisees. There was tension when the Talmud was composed in the first centuries AD. And there's tension now. But where we see the loss of that tension, where we see the rise of this phenomenon of Judeo-Christianity, we see the rise really of a big lie. And hopefully Orthodoxy will always have that tension, always affirming that Jesus of Nazareth is the Christ.
We're commanded, this is another thing I've seen from, let's say, the Zionist right online, is that we're commanded to love one another. So anyone who's talking or critiquing Judaism in any way whatsoever is not obeying Christ's commandments to love their neighbor. What is your answer to that sort of thing?
Well, it does depend on what's going on internally, I think. If you actually hate Jews and you're coming from that perspective, then you're not coming from an Orthodox Christian perspective, just as you say, because we're commanded to love one another and indeed to love our enemies. And so even if Rabbinic Judaism presents itself as hostile to the claims of the Orthodox Church, well, we still need to love those people. We're commanded to, even if we don't want to. But we're commanded to love them, and so we try to. Just as we're commanded to love people around us, we may not want to. That's Christ's overriding instruction. So we should approach these questions with love. And really that means when addressing Judaism, what we're hoping for is to witness to the unique saving truth of the Orthodox Church, so as to demonstrate to others, so as to witness to others that they may partake of that themselves. But if we don't expound the truth, if we take refuge in terms such as Judeo-Christianity, then we're not witnessing to the truth.
Mm-hmm. Amen. Another thing, and I still sort of get confused with this sometimes, even having done several episodes on it. Sometimes I feel like this confusion is put out there purposefully. By who? That's a whole different discussion. But what does it mean to be Jewish in 2025 anyway?
Well, the term has come to imply really an ethnicity or a tribal affiliation. So historically, it meant somebody who practiced the Judaic religion. But in more modern times, after the emancipation of Jewry from the ghettos of Europe in the late 18th and 19th centuries, it's come to mean to include those people who are Jewish ethnically or culturally. And in fact, the Jewish state, the state of Israel, defines a Jew as somebody whose mother is Jewish. And so that's the criterion. If your mother is Jewish, then you're Jewish. And by that, you have a right to return to the state of Israel and make a life there, because it's for all Jews everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And there is, of course, room for conversion. You can also convert through an Orthodox mechanism. That's, though not many people do, of course. So today it has largely an ethnic connotation. And the irony is, I think, that a lot of hardcore anti-Semites, those people who really hate Jews just because they're Jews, would agree that being a Jew is a racial or ethnic category rather than a religious one.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there can be disagreement. A lot of Jews say that no, you have to practice the religion in order to be considered Jewish. The state of Israel disagrees.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier the Talmud. I want to ask you about that. There's been lots of discussion in Orthodox circles on it. I've heard people that say that they're Jewish say, "Oh, you guys are making a big deal out of this. No one reads that. It doesn't mean anything to us. We only believe the Torah." What is the Talmud, and what does it mean to Rabbinic Judaism?
Well, the Talmud is really the highest authority in Rabbinic Judaism, even though the Torah or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, is made a lot of. But the Talmud is really how the Hebrew Bible is understood. It's the lens through which one sees the books of the Bible. And the Talmud is enormous. Translated into English, it's maybe 6,000 pages.
Wow.
And even then, not all of it is translated. And that's why, certain rabbis and others can spend their entire lives studying it, trying to understand it. And the belief is that when God revealed himself to Moses on Sinai in the book of Genesis, not only did he give the 10 Commandments, but he gave what they believed to be an oral law, which was given down not in writing, but orally. And that eventually was handed down generation by generation and was then finally written down in the centuries AD, the first millennium AD, as the Talmud. And this is something that Orthodox Christianity, of course, totally rejects. We accept the Bible and the books of the Bible as the Word of God, not some oral law that was eventually written down. And in fact, if you look at the book of Exodus, the language is that Moses wrote down in a book everything that God said. And those are the books of the Old Testament, the books of the Pentateuch. So there's a fundamental disagreement as to how God revealed himself to mankind. But those who passed down the oral law and then wrote the Talmud and now interpret the Talmud, they are really the authority within Judaism, the rabbis, the interpreters of the Talmud.
Is it sort of, in their eyes, the proof that Christ is not the Messiah and the quote-unquote Messiah has not returned?
Well, certainly that's a claim in the Talmud. There's a book by Peter Schaeffer of Princeton University called Jesus in the Talmud. And it's a useful little book. And it describes how Jesus of Nazareth is understood by Rabbinic Judaism. And a lot of it is absolutely scurrilous, which I will not repeat. But basically that he was a bad student of a rabbi, certainly not the Son of God, that he founded a cult, i.e. the Christian cult, after himself, and that he used magic to appear to heal people and perform miracles. And his fate is not in heaven, needless to say, it's in hell, and precisely I won't say. But I mentioned it in my essay, Is God an Antisemite? But so there's the Talmud absolutely rejects Jesus of Nazareth as anybody other than an imposter who was rightly killed. Not just that, it was sort of a mistake, or we didn't understand that he was the Son of God, or this, that. No. He was a criminal, a blasphemer who needed to be put to death.
And to what extent is the Talmud, I say it strangely, forgive me, Talmud, read or discussed in modern Rabbinic Judaism temples, basically, or circles, if you will?
Well, it's considered really the highest authority.
Okay.
And so it's read and studied in yeshivas and by rabbis all over the world to this day. And in fact, it's very closely guarded, really, because if you're not Jewish, you're not supposed to read it. For the reasons maybe that we've given implicitly. But no, it's authoritative to this day. And of course, there are many Jews today who aren't Orthodox or students of classical Rabbinic Judaism. They're just, they're more or less ordinary people who identify as Jews. But I would argue that there is still sort of a cultural hangover for Jews generally from the Talmud, which is very deleterious in a Christian civilization or a civilization that wants to be Christian.
Let's talk about the Bolshevik Revolution and early communism. And we're starting to understand now, I believe, more broadly than I certainly used to, that Judaism did play a role in early communism. Can you talk about that?
Certainly. And again, it does speak to the question of who's a Jew. Because the activists, the Bolsheviks, and others who overthrew the provisional government in 1917 in Russia, for the most part, I think we can say they were not terribly observant Jews. But they would nonetheless be considered Jews by the state of Israel today because they had Jewish heritage. And they certainly would not identify as Christian. And so, yes, the reality is, if you look at, even if you look at people like Winston Churchill, who wrote about this in 1920, Zionism versus Bolshevism, an essay that can be found online, the fact is that the Bolsheviks were overwhelmingly Jewish, even though Jews, only made up a small percentage of the Russian Empire. And when Bolshevism really got going in the late teens and early 20s, Jews flocked to Moscow and Leningrad from all around the world to be part of what they understood was really a Jewish movement, a movement to build the ideal society on earth. And this is really an ancient Judaic idea, because when the Messiah comes from the Judaic perspective, he will build or fulfill a perfect society on earth, which is something that of course, Orthodox Christians reject. The perfect society is in heaven. It's not to be found in this world, apart from the church. So the early Bolsheviks were overwhelmingly Jewish. Kevin MacDonald has written about this. Michael Hoffman has written about this. And a lot of the primary sources that witness to this have now been basically discarded as anti-Semitic.
Right.
So they can't be trusted because they're anti-Semitic, even though these were people who were there. They were correspondents for major newspapers. Robert Wilton, Douglas Reed, and others. They're thrown away as anti-Semitic because they simply point out the facts that the Bolsheviks were overwhelmingly Jewish. Even Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in his book 200 Years Together, it still hasn't been translated officially into English, even though it came out years ago, and he won the Nobel Prize before, of course, because it's critical of Judaic influence in Russia. Or it's not even critical, it's just really an reasonably accurate telling of the history. But many people regard that as anti-Semitic, even though Solzhenitsyn had a Jewish wife and he raised 3 sons as Jews. So in Bolshevism, we have to remember, for our own sake as Orthodox Christians, was I think the single most destructive political movement ever to befall an Orthodox Christian people. Tens of millions of Orthodox Christians were killed because they were loyal to the monarch, to Tsar Nicholas II, or loyal to the church, or otherwise. They were considered counter-revolutionaries. And so one of the greatest, this fact, this reality, this part of history, I think is sadly neglected. When we think, for example, of all the books and movies and so on that have come out about the Second World War and the Holocaust of the Jews, and yet silence, when it comes to the genocide waged against Orthodox Christians in Russia and elsewhere, it's astonishing that there's this huge cultural disconnect.
Mm-hmm. I wonder why that is.
Well, yeah, we can only speculate, but I think that it fits a narrative of Jews as victims and never as perpetrators. Mm-hmm. And I think that was really the principal failing of Spencer's book, is that he's unwilling to say really, or that, look, sometimes Jews have done terrible things in history. But no, if you say that, you're an anti-Semite. And he'll touch on, for example, Jewish involvement in Bolshevism, but he disregards it. It's not that important. Churchill didn't really know what he was talking about, for example, when it came to Bolshevism, and he poo-poos it. And mm-hmm. Can you imagine somebody writing a book now or a screenplay that would poo-poo, Nazism? As well, it wasn't really that bad, sort of misunderstood. Yes, a lot of Germans were involved, but a lot weren't. And so we really can't make any sweeping allegations about it. I mean, that person would be shown the door.
Yeah. We've got a new sponsor. It is Perfect Spiral Capital. This is the infinity banking concept. Break free from the system. Perfect Spiral Capital helps you build wealth on your terms, outside of the control of the corporate banking cartel and the state-manipulated markets. Invest like a dissident, a true dissident. Take ownership of your financial future with strategies designed for those who refuse to be cogs in the machine. No handouts, no bailouts, just real results. Opt out, build wealth. The state inflates your savings away while Wall Street rigs the game. You guys know this. Perfect Spiral Capital helps you stack real assets and create lasting independence. Go to perfectspiralcapital.com/counterflow and get a special offer for fans of this show. Again, that's perfectspiralcapital.com/counterflow. Another term I've heard more recently than not, critiquing, they'll call you an anti-Semite if you critique the neoconservatives, and which I find almost like telling in a way. But certainly we understand the roots of that neoconservative movement were Trotskyites, essentially. A lot of them were Jewish. And then it seems to come logically then that they are the ones that have been propping up foreign wars and whatnot, and trying and always defending the state of Israel in the Middle East. Any thoughts on just sort of that movement with our foreign policy and how that's all ended up with the neoconservatives in America now?
Well, of course, a lot of neoconservatives are Jews. A lot of them aren't. But that is a fact. But I do think that the neoconservative movement, if you want to call it that, has basically driven American foreign policy for the past few decades towards globalization or imperialism and Zionism. It sort of has those two wings to it, two attributes principally. And so America has found herself up to her eyeballs in war throughout the world, in Iraq and Afghanistan, throughout the Middle East, Now we are supporting Ukraine, of course. We're rattling the bars in South America, as opposed to a defensive posture that would really look after our own territorial interests in the Western Hemisphere. But if one believes, for example, that the state of Israel is Israel, the chosen people of God, or the chosen nation of God, well, then you have this very flimsy but nonetheless justification for supporting it. And that's what's been happening, I think. So certainly a lot of Jewish neoconservatives have been involved in that, but a lot of Christian neoconservatives or vaguely Christian neoconservatives have been involved as well.
Did you happen to see Ted Cruz interviewed by Tucker Carlson?
I did see Ted Cruz interviewed by Tucker Carlson, and I mean, it's hard to do it justice, really, as to how bad or ignorant it is. He is. I mean, citing the Old Testament promise to Abraham that, who blesses you, I will bless, and who curses you, I will curse. And therefore, we're supposed to support the government of Benjamin Netanyahu today. Talk about a stretch of logic. We can wish well the state of Israel as a nation state like other nation states, that they can live in peace and so on, even though their policies tend to be very aggressive and expansionary, but not treat them as God's chosen people, and therefore we're supposed to give them guns and munitions and money.
Mm-hmm. Where does that narrative of God's chosen people come from?
Well, I think it does come from the Old Testament. That I'm blanking on a scriptural passage, but that the Hebrews were God's chosen, but that they were Israel, or more precisely, and this is an important distinction, I think, those among the Hebrew people who followed God were the true Israel. Because again, the Old Testament is full of instances where the Hebrews, follow other gods. They undertake pagan practices. They neglect the laws given by God, and God has to send prophets to them to rebuke them and bring them back into the fold, or indeed allow some disaster to befall them so they'll turn around towards Him. And the chosen people of God are always those who have done the will of God. Just as Christ says, those who love me will keep my commandments. Well, the people who keep His commandments, they're the chosen of God. But again, that doesn't mean, or you don't have to be ethnically Jewish or ethnically anything to be chosen of God. You have to keep His commandments.
Do you see... So let's take Ted Cruz for this example, because there's a lot of people, certainly at Pastor Hagee's church where I went, that sort of have a vague understanding. I mean, understanding is a bad term, but a vague thought of what Ted Cruz said would be correct. And that's why we do this. Hagee had Israeli flags on either side of his stage back then, probably still does. Do you see it as some sort of movement to subvert the true Christianity in order to get Christians to think that way?
Well, what the precise motivation is, of Pastor Hagee or of somebody, I'm not sure, but it definitely is subversive to any kind of orthodox understanding of what the church is. I think really that Zionism today, and you could even say Rabbinic Judaism itself, is really a very powerful heresy.
Yes.
And part of that heresy is that we can build on earth a perfect society if we only labor, strongly enough. We can do it. Partly because we're the chosen people of God. We can do it. Whereas the Orthodox Church, of course, rejects that and says, no, eternity is the realm of the perfect society, not within human history. Now, we can find the perfect society now. We can connect to it in the church. The church is the perfect society, even though it's filled with people who are sinners and fallen and broken and everything else. But there's your perfect society, not a temporal political thing. And so ultimately, I think these heresies, Zionism and Judaism, will culminate in the Antichrist. And the fathers tell us that the Antichrist indeed will be received by Jews, the majority of Jews, as the Messiah, because he will crown a process that is already trying to build a one world society. And he will make it appear that the old problems of war and strife and that sort of thing are gone. If we have a universal order crowned by this man who comes at the end of history, fulfilling that ancient heretical dream of a perfect society. So all these things are already afoot. And I think the religion, if you want to call it that, of Antichrist will be, for the most part, Judeo-Christianity. Because he will unite Jews who are looking for the Messiah because they didn't accept Christ when he came. And it will unite heterodox Christians who are looking for Christ to come again and to rule in a political capacity, which is something that Orthodoxy rejects.
Mm-hmm. Warnings from St. Paul on some of this, certainly St. John Chrysostom as well. Can you get us into some of that?
Well, I think one of the problems that St. Paul addressed and St. John Chrysostom addressed, and it's been sort of a perennial problem, is that of Judaizing. Mm-hmm. That there's been a segment of the church which wants to incline towards the ideas present in the Judaic religion. And those ideas, of course, have been present throughout the Old Testament and into the New. Namely that, yes, we can sort of build on earth a perfect society without the church or in parallel to the church. Or really that we can adopt, from a salvific point of view, a legal framework. This is something that I think basically happened in the West following the Great Schism in the 11th century, that Roman Catholicism became very legalistic. Mm-hmm. And I think it was largely influenced by Judaic influences, which of course are very legalistic, that you follow these certain rules, you do certain things, and okay, you're good. And there's something intellectually or psychologically satisfying about that. So you don't really need faith. You don't really need repentance. You just follow the rules. And if you break the rules when you do certain other things to fix that, and you move on. Whereas Orthodoxy is not like that. Yes, we have guidelines, if you will, as to how to live a moral and acceptable life, the commands of Christ. But it's really about the internal state of the person, the state of the heart. Which is not a legalistic idea, and it requires faith and repentance, and those can be difficult things.
The discussion. Well, let me ask you this before we even get there: do you know? I've never heard this. The rabbinic Jewish view on St. Paul.
Oh, I don't know precisely. Okay. I haven't encountered it, but I can only imagine what it is. I mean, if the Talmud speaks of the Lord in the way that it does, in such outrageous language, I can only imagine what they say about St. Paul, who was, in a sense, the great adversary of the Pharisees of his day. And it was the Pharisees who really were the spiritual seed of the rabbis who came later, and the those who wrote the Talmud, and then those who interpreted it.
Mm-hmm. You in this book, I'll show it again, that you wrote, Antichrist. the fulfillment of globalization. You talk towards the end about the empire of the Pharisees. I assume that's sort of what you've been alluding to throughout this discussion. Is that the perfect society?
Yes, a fraudulent society,
Yes.
but that's its self-understanding. When Christ was presented to the mob in Jerusalem on Great Friday, they were given a choice. Pilate said, "Look, I'll release you a prisoner. You can have Barabbas, who was a murderer and a revolutionary, or you can have he who is called Christ, the King of the Jews." And we know what the mob chose. They chose, "Give us Barabbas, save Barabbas." And so I think this is, in a microcosm, a much larger, it tells us in microcosm that ancient idea of revolution as the key to the perfect society.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what I think you see throughout the modern age, for example. Revolution after revolution after revolution. Most of them failures, most of them fantastically destructive. But the hope was that if we only, in a sense, kill enough people, if we only shed enough blood, we can build a new and glorious society on earth. It's a lie. It's a fundamentally a lie. And those who chose Christ and the successors of those people in the church reject revolution, political revolution. Whereas, again, the empire of the Pharisees is that ancient dream. Give us Barabbas. Give us a political figure that we can see and touch, that will lead us into the Holy Land today, now, without the need for repentance, without the need for faith, without the need for patience. We want it here and now.
We've got some new shirts, Counterflow with Buck Johnson on the front pocket, on the back, a beautiful graphic with, of course, dissident voices and unapproved opinions. You can see this on the YouTube version of the show, of course. We're putting graphic up now. $30 flat fee. $30 gets you the t-shirt. The PayPal address is buck@counterflowpodcast.com. That is my PayPal. You can send $30 that method. Send me your address and the size you want. We have sizes small through 2XL. Again, sizes small through 2XL. Go to PayPal, $30, buck@counterflowpodcast.com. Give me your address in there and the t-shirt will be yours. To sort of give a hat tip to a series of books, a 3-part series, how many of these revolutions and the revolutionary spirit have been over the centuries have been, let's say, rooted in Judaism or have Jewish roots? Not how many even necessarily, but which other ones besides we've talked about Bolshevism?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Bolshevism is the outstanding example. But in the modern era, a lot of political and intellectual movements have been led by Jews and have been inspired to some extent by the principles of Judaism. Neoconservatism, I think, is a good example of that.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that we can use American power to reshape the world in our image while supporting the state of Israel, in a sense, as the crown jewel of the American empire.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly, I think you could make the argument that even if a lot of the revolutionaries weren't Jews themselves, they were inspired to a great deal by Judaism. And there's a book written by Rabbi Louis Israel Newman, I think, called Jewish Influences on Christian Reform Movements, about 100 years ago. And basically, the argument of that book is that, yeah, it was Judaism that inspired the Reformation, that inspired even Western Christian movements before the Reformation and after it, and really what we would identify as Orthodox as the inspiration for various heresies. And again, if we think of Judaism as a heresy, then it makes a lot more sense. And a lot of movements, the English Puritan movement was likely, I think, inspired greatly, if not directly, then indirectly by Judaic sources.
I want to ask you about the dangers of people having sort of the worldview that Ted Cruz has, because again, unfortunately, it's especially in the South. I know you live in the Northeast, but in the South, that when I heard him say that, I know there was people that were like, "Oh my gosh, where did he get this ridiculous idea from?" And I'm like, I grew up hearing some of this often, and I know that it's somewhat widespread still. I do think the age of information has sort of helped. There's a fall off with that sort of philosophy, but the dangers of Zionism and the quote unquote chosen people narrative on foreign policy and what some of the people have goals as far as foreign policy goes, the dangers that this sort of thing can lead to.
Well, certainly if one regards anybody anywhere as the chosen people, chosen of God, and in a sense they can do no wrong, well, that completely destroys any traditional Christian ideas of morality. And we saw it in the Second World War in Germany, the idea of the master race. Well, many people thought, well, we can do no wrong because we're the Aryan race. Therefore, we can slaughter Jews. We can slaughter Poles and Catholics and Slavs and others not like us. We don't have traditional moral restraints. The Bolsheviks thought the same thing. And so if we regard Israel, the state of Israel, in that light as, well, that's the chosen people, then in a sense they can get away with anything, because God loves them specially regardless. And so if they're slaughtering people in Gaza or torching farms and villages in the West Bank or bombing other countries and that sort of thing, well, evidently that's part of God's plan for them, logically. But again, you find yourself in this conundrum that, well, how does one enforce any kind of restraint on God's chosen people? Well, it's very hard to.
Yeah, there's almost, I could see a correlation between believing the chosen people narrative and then also believing once saved, always saved, because it could lead to similar outcomes. It's like, well, he's saved already, so you can go kind of do whatever you want.
Yeah, and I think that idea, if I just make a point here, that interjection, that I think that idea of once saved, always saved is really a Judaic idea.
Mm-hmm.
It came from the self-understanding of the Jews as the chosen people, as people who are saved because of who they are and what they are. And I think, Protestantism, much of Protestantism in that regard, works along the same lines. If you affirm Jesus is your Lord and Savior, well, then you're saved, past tense, and your future is certain. Whereas Orthodoxy, of course, doesn't accept that.
Mm-hmm. There's, with all things, a royal path to walk here. I want to ask you about the challenges in this topic we've been discussing with anti-Semitism and also speaking truth. Within the Orthodox Church, the challenges you see us facing as far as this whole discussion goes?
Well, again, we have to stick to our guns, and we have to be willing to say there is no such thing as Judeo-Christianity. There is, and in many ways, Christianity itself, that term, is a modern abstraction. It's derivative of something else. It's derivative from the church. That the church, the Orthodox Church, something you can see, smell, taste, and touch, that is God's kingdom on earth. And we're all called to be part of it. And as Americans, we're also involved in this, even if we're Orthodox, we're involved in this grave heresy of Zionism, because our country is allied at the hip with the state of Israel. And And the Zionism is extremely powerful here politically. John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt wrote an excellent book, The Israel Lobby, the first book sort of to expose that. So we have a practical problem with that in this country, as well as a religious or a theological problem. So we must stick to the church as not an abstraction, but a real living thing, Christ's body on earth, of which we can all be a part, and in that find salvation.
Have you seen, from your perspective, public opinion on the state of Israel, let's say, shifting over the last couple of years?
I think so. I think it's actually been shifting really over the course of some months. I think there's been a general realization, especially among younger people, that the policies of the state of Israel towards Gaza in particular are indefensible. That the Hamas attack of October 7, 2023, just about everybody will decry that. But it's only fairly recently that people are willing to decry or maybe just become aware of the siege of Gaza, for lack of a better word. So I think there has been a change, but not really among the elites or the dominant political circles. I think they're still very much Zionists, and the state of Israel performs a useful role, sort of a neo-colonial role for the United States, in it's basically an unsinkable aircraft carrier on the Eastern Mediterranean. And if we want to bomb Iran or control the Middle East, the Israelis will help us with that, just as we will help them if they want to do so.
Yeah, I've even heard the talking point of, okay, it's not about the chosen people. It's not about Zionism. It's just about Israel's the only democracy over there. And it seems like as public opinion on let's say, anti-Semitism changes and Zionism, public opinions may be more critical of it. Now the new thing is to say, well, yeah, but they're a democracy. And so that's really why we're tied at the hip, with that guy.
Yeah, I don't buy that argument that the state of Israel is a democracy. It's really, I think, an ethnocracy. I mean, non-Jews in the state of Israel have nominal rights. They get to vote and can hold office and do certain things, but they are repressed in an important sense in that because it's considered the Jewish state, self-consciously the Jewish state, then the number of non-Jews is not allowed to get that high. And there's all sorts of discrimination, sort of unofficial discrimination against non-Jews in the state of Israel today, and has been, as well as the explicit persecution of non-Jewish Palestinians and others in the surrounding regions. Sometimes militarily. So I don't accept that state of Israel is a democracy, even if many people do make that argument.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts on Donald Trump and his relationship with Netanyahu, the state of Israel, relative to past presidents?
I think in some way Trump's ego is working at least a little bit now, I think, for the good. Because I think he started to grow tired of the tail wagging the dog, of Netanyahu sort of setting the parameters of what U.S.-Israeli policy is going to be. And so when Trump came out and said, no, we will not accept annexation of the West Bank, and we have to have this peace agreement in Gaza, even if Hamas isn't immediately destroyed, though now they're talking about, of course, disarmament. I think that was Trump wanting to get himself in front of the cameras more than Netanyahu. Mm-hmm. But what's remarkable, I think, mostly, is the continuity across Democratic and Republican administrations with the support for the state of Israel, dating back, for decades now. That no matter what they do or who's in charge in Washington, the basic policy is the same. And I think it does stem in many ways from that Judeo-Christian myth that we're a great Christian nation, they're a great Jewish nation, and we should have all these interests in common. I don't think we do, but a lot of people see it that way.
I'll let you have the floor here. Any closing thoughts you want to leave people with on this topic? And then we'll let you plug, of course, the book, the article, anything.
Well, I think that we have to be careful. Certainly in the United States, we're seeing it increasingly in Britain and Europe, repression with respect to anti-Semitism. And so if one, as well as other things, but repression in general, but including anti-Semitism. So if you're regarded as having said something anti-Semitic or being anti-Semitic, you can get in serious trouble for it. And we have now in the Congress the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which passed, I believe, the House in 2024, and it's sort of floating around in the Senate. And I think it's lost a fair amount of momentum, thanks largely to what's been going on in the Holy Land with the siege of Gaza becoming more well-known and that kind of thing. But it's still there. And the expectation is that it will pass in due course and Trump will sign it. And it's especially targeting colleges and universities under the Civil Rights Act. But it's to me, it's the thin end of the wedge. The Bolsheviks, one of the first things they did was to criminalize anti-Semitism in revolutionary Russia. And so to have that happen here in this country, in the United States, to have anti-Semitism maybe 10 years from now, 20 years from now, made illegal, as nutty as that sounds, well, it's a possibility because it's happened before. And a lot of the same motivations, I think, that drove the Bolsheviks are driving a lot of people today in different ways. But looking for that perfect society on earth, sort of vaguely in the back of their minds, is still powerful. And that means extirpating by law that stuff which you don't like anti-Semitism, is bad. It should be illegal.
Yeah, and again, it's so vague at this point. So it's almost like, let's make a law against being mean or something. It's like, well, what does that mean to you? I heard Candace once speaking with a rabbi, Candace Owens speaking with a rabbi, and he said, if you're against Zionism, then you're an anti-Semite. If you're against supporting the state of Israel, you're an anti-Semite. It's like, well, then, it just gets more ridiculous the more you extrapolate meaning from things. Plug away, sir. Anything you'd like.
Well, thank you. Thank you for showing the book. Yep,
yes.
Antichrist, The Fulfillment of Globalization. It's still out there on Amazon as well as at Uncut Mountain Press. And then my essay on Robert Spencer's book about anti-Semitism is available at the Orthodox Ethos blog, orthodoxethos.com, and then go to their blog and scroll down a ways because it's been out for a little while. It's entitled, Is God an Anti-Semite? The answer, of course, as we've discussed, is no, he's not, because he is a Semite. Mm-hmm. But by the logic of Spencer's book, one might think he is, because he rebukes the people of God in the Old Testament and elsewhere.
The Orthodox Ethos. I'll take just 1 second to appreciate the great Father Peter Heers. We love him on this show, and I'm glad he's helping you publish articles and books and all of these things. So Thank you very much for being here, Mr. GM Davis.
Thank you, sir.
All right, I hope you guys got a lot out of that. I enjoy having Mr. GM Davis on the show. Go get that book, Antichrist, The Fulfillment of Globalization, The Ancient Church and the End of History. It's very good. As for this show, hit like, subscribe, leave comments, all those things. Follow me on X at BuckRebel, BuckRebel. And I've got a new Substack. The guys at Dissident Media and the lady at Dissident Media have convinced me I need to do a Substack piece at least once a month. My first one was on Hot Topic Christianity. You can go search the Substack app or site, however you use it, Counterflow with Buck Johnson, and you will find it. Until next week, you guys have a good one.
Like the sound of the Counterflow Podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.
This has been